always been an interesting question. Why do those people who have done the most to destroy the image of our country, the standing of it, who have the most amount of blood on their hands, who lie so frequently, who embrace authoritarianism, why are those people the ones who most hate and fear Trump? To the point where they completely transformed into the opposite politically of what they were, and why are they now the leaders, the thought leaders, the most popular pundits for American liberalism? And what we've seen over the last week is this incredible theater where they've all decided they're going to read from the same script. They ran to all the corporate media outlets, the biggest ones in the United States, that hired them in the wake of all those lies. And they used those newspapers to send out the same script, almost verbatim, about how Donald Trump is Hitler. We know that everybody in American discourse who you're supposed to hate immediately gets turned into the new Hitler. It was done to Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad and Ahmadinejad in Iran, and Vladimir Putin in Russia, now Hamas, and of course Donald Trump, and any Republican politicians who in any way are attentive to the populist wing of that party rather than to its establishment wing. The obvious proximate cause for this panic that neocons are all the polls showing that Joe Biden is in very serious trouble heading into 2024. And Donald Trump is stronger than ever. One of the polls that most triggered this kind of hysteria was this New York Times poll from November 5th. Trump leads in 5 critical states as voters blast Biden. The New York Times Siena poll finds. And it said voters in battleground states said they trusted Donald J. Trump over President Biden on the economy, foreign policy, and immigration, as Mr. Biden's multiracial base shows signs of fraying. And here you see the graph showing that Trump is now clearly ahead in 5 of the 6 swing states, all of which Joe Biden won in 2020. Up 10 in Nevada, 5 in Arizona, 4 in Pennsylvania, 6 in Georgia, and 5 in Michigan. The only one where Biden leads Trump is in Wisconsin by 2 points. And what really scares them the most is the fleeing of black voters, Latino voters, and Muslim voters, all the people they thought they held captive forever, who are now saying they won't vote for Biden and or will actually vote for Trump. Here from November 28th is Gallup's findings, poor marks for Biden on the Middle East, the economy, and foreign affairs. Oh, is that all? Just the Middle East, the economy, and foreign affairs? Biden is an extremely unpopular president. People do not trust his judgment in any way. And of course, they can see that his brain is melting before our eyes, and it spells gigantic trouble for the Democrats, and these neocons know it. And at the same time, Donald Trump's lead is bigger than ever in the Republican primary, to the point where big donors have abandoned Ron DeSantis and now are pouring millions and millions of dollars into a desperate effort to prop up Nikki Haley. That's their last hope. Nikki Haley, selling Nikki Haley to the Republican base over Donald Trump. What has made matters a lot worse for Biden is the war in Israel, the war by Israel in Gaza, because the Israel-Palestinian issue has really been on the back burner for many years. We barely talked about it on this show in the last couple of years. We barely just debated it in our political culture in general. The last time there was a major bombing campaign by Israel on Gaza was 2014. They've been bombing them every year periodically, but the big sustained last bombing campaign was 24 years ago. It was in 2014 under President Obama. That's 9 years ago. And there are a ton of new voters, new Americans paying attention to politics for the first time since then, in part because of Donald Trump, and in part just because young people every year become adults and start paying attention to politics. And this is the first look a lot of American liberals are getting of Israel, and most importantly, of how steadfastly the Democratic Party supports Israel. And they're watching every night on TV dead Palestinian babies and videos of thousands of Palestinians being killed, and they're hearing Joe Biden said, of course we're going to keep funding and arming Israel. And it's something they didn't know and they're horrified by. And that's really costing Joe Biden in his base. Young voters, people of color, Muslims. Here from Politico on December 2nd, swing state Muslim leaders launched a campaign to, quote, abandon Biden in 2024. Now, Muslim voters are not a very powerful or significant part of our voting constituency numerically, but they're concentrated in several key states, in particular Michigan, that Joe Biden absolutely needs if he has any chance of being reelected in 2024. So you have Muslim American leaders telling the Muslims who are part of their organizations and who listen to them that Biden's support for Israel and its devastation of Gaza is a red line that means they shouldn't vote for him. That is real political trouble. Here's Politico, quote, the bubbling anger among Arab and Muslim Americans over the president's handling of the Israel-Hamas conflict could threaten his chances of re-election. The bubbling anger among Arab and Muslim Americans could threaten Biden's chances of re-election in many of the swing states in 2024, all of which contain key pockets of Arab American and Muslim American voting blocs. The growing Muslim American population is roughly 3.45 million people, according to Pew. In 2020, roughly 59% of Arab Americans supported Biden, according to the Arab American Institute, but recent polling suggests his support has continued to deteriorate. Now, obviously, Trump is a very pro-Israel politician. His presidency was extremely pro-Israel. He moved the embassy to Jerusalem, something that only years earlier was considered a fringe idea. It didn't become controversial because the senior Democrat in Washington, the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, stood up and said, I agree with Trump, I support Trump, I congratulate him on what he did. Trump had made early signs in 2015 and 2016 that his instinct as someone who wants to forge deals was, according to him, the United States was too pro-Israel and lost any standing to be a fair broker negotiating a deal, which generals have long said is crucial to American national security. He said, we can't be so pro-Israel if you want to have credibility to negotiate a deal. But very quickly after that, when that caused a conflict, that was one of the things that made neocons hate and distrust Trump. He got very on board with the opposite narrative, became extremely pro-Israel, went to AIPAC, began listening less to Steve Bannon and more to Jared Kushner. And his president, he was very pro-Israel, so there's no reason from a Muslim Arab perspective to think Trump would be better. But they're not saying they're going to vote for Trump. They're saying they just won't vote. And if you believe that what Israel is doing is a war crime or a crime against humanity, as a lot of people do, and you know that Joe Biden is the one enabling it, of course that's a red line for a lot of voters. So Biden was already in big trouble in the polls. This is obviously making it worse, losing your most energized and important base. And now what you're seeing is a major media meltdown. People petrified in the media that Trump might win again, and they know they have no control over the voting populace. The voting populace has tuned these people out. So all they can do is reach for the most extremist, unhinged script possible. And it's amazing, just in the last 3 days, to watch every major American media outlet practically instantly embrace the same exact script. They're like dancing seals, trained seals that are dancing to the same music. So many liberal digital outlets that are based in Brooklyn have failed over the last decade. It's not hard to understand why. All these digital outlets, the Huffington Post and BuzzFeed and Vice, that have been ravaged by layoffs, that can't make money, are just Democratic Party spokespeople. But when you have the New York Times and CNN and the Washington Post and much bigger outlets, The Atlantic, who are doing that also, who are also talking about how Trump is Orange Hitler, why does anybody need these digital outlets? They sound exactly like MSNBC and CNN and the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so there's no reason to read them, and nobody is. And that's why they're all suffering huge layoffs, because they're completely redundant. It's a herd mentality. They all say exactly the same things in exactly the same way. So look at how this is being done. Here's the New York Times from today. Why a second Trump presidency may be more radical than his first. Obviously, the problem here in trying to convince Americans that they shouldn't vote for Trump because he'll be a new Hitler is that Trump was already president for 4 years. He didn't put dissidents in concentration camps. He didn't close media outlets. He didn't execute people because they're minorities. It's very hard to convince people that Trump is going to be the new Hitler when they already watched him for 4 years. Even if they didn't like him, they didn't see any Hitlerian behavior. So they have to escalate the rhetoric. No, this time we really mean it. Quote, Donald Trump has long exhibited authoritarian impulses, said the New York Times, but his policy operation is now more sophisticated, and the buffers to check him are weaker. Mr. Trump's violent and authoritarian rhetoric on the 2024 campaign trail has attracted growing alarm in comparisons to historical fascist dictators and contemporary populist strongmen. As he runs for president again, facing 4 criminal prosecutions, Mr. Trump may seem more angry, desperate, and dangerous to American-style democracy than in his first term. No U.S. president before him has toyed with withdrawing from NATO, the military alliance, and the Western world. He said he would fundamentally reevaluate NATO's purpose and NATO's mission in a second term. All right, first of all, Trump said the same thing in 2016. Why are we in NATO? Why are we spending all this money to protect Western Europe when they don't spend any money on our defense? Secondly, withdrawing from NATO is not a fascist or authoritarian move. If anything, NATO has been responsible for all sorts of wars, offensive wars in Yugoslavia that had nothing to do with defending Europe, bombing Serbia. We were told it was because of Milosevic's war crimes that had nothing to do with defending Europe. Regime change in Libya that had nothing to do with defending Europe from attack, the original purpose of NATO. And then what's happening in Ukraine, I would argue the same thing, but leave that aside. So people debate NATO because they should debate NATO. Trump did it in 2016. This isn't even new, and questioning NATO is not the stuff of fascism. You're allowed to question NATO. We should be questioning NATO. Quote, more than anything else, and I can't believe they're using this as the argument for why Trump is going to be the new Hitler. Mr. Trump's vow to use the Justice Department to wreak vengeance against his adversaries is a naked challenge to democratic values. Building on how hard he tried to get prosecutors to go after his enemies while in office, it would end the post-Watergate norm of investigative independence from White House political control. They just said in the prior paragraph that Trump himself faces 4 separate indictments and prosecutions on felony charges, 2 from the Biden Justice Department, 2 from liberal state prosecutors, 1 in Georgia, 1 in New York. Hunter Biden, the whole case was corrupted by aggressive White House protection and Justice Department protection as 2 IRS whistleblowers came forward to warn, only to then watch his plea deal fall apart the minute it was subjected to judicial scrutiny. How can these same people who are cheering Trump's imprisonment, who know that the only chance they have to win, or one of the main chances, is to put Trump in prison, their main political adversary, how can they then turn around and say the reason Trump's going to be a Hitler is because he's going to weaponize the Justice Department against his political opponents? Which is exactly what's being done now by them. Here's The Atlantic from Jeffrey Goldberg, arguably the single most dishonest and deceitful American journalist with the most amount of blood on his hands, unless you count Bill Kristol as a journalist or David Frum as one. And of course, David Frum also works at The Atlantic. December 4th, also today. A warning, America survived the first Trump term, though not without sustaining serious damage. A second term, if there is one, will be much worse. It's amazing. Both the New York Times and The Atlantic out with exactly the same narrative, exactly the same script today. Quote, if there is a bottom, no sure thing, he's getting closer. Tom Nichols, who writes for The Atlantic's daily newsletter and is one of our in-house experts on authoritarianism, argued in mid-November that Trump has finally earned the epithet fascist. Oh, really? Because this is all he's been called for the last 5 years by all of these media outlets. Now we're hearing that according to experts, now it's finally time to call Trump a fascist. Quote, for weeks, Trump has been ramping up the rhetoric, Nichols wrote. Early last month, he echoed the vile and obsessively germophobic language of Adolf Hitler by describing immigrants as disease-ridden terrorists and psychiatric patients who are, quote, poisoning the blood of our country. Our team of brilliant writers makes a convincingly dispositive case that both Trump and Trumpism pose an existential threat to America and to the ideas that animate it. The country survived the first Trump term. They're not without serious damage. The second one, if there is one, will be much worse. I know Democrats talk so affectionately about immigrants, and yet the border is exactly the same as it was under Trump. All these immigrants who are being detained in these facilities that caused AOC to go in 2018 and pose for cameras while she was dressed in all white and crying, none of that has changed. So what they do is, as usual, is they take very American policies, attribute them to Trump, and then call him Hitler. Here is one of the worst neocons, Robert Kagan. We devoted an entire show to Bill Kristol a couple months ago and all his warmongering and the bloodshed he's responsible for with all the deceit he spread. His partner in all that was Robert Kagan. They invented modern-day neoconservatism in the 1990s with a project for a new American century that called for regime change in Iraq and many other countries before 9/11, and they exploited 9/11 to bring usher it in. Robert Kagan is also the husband of Victoria Nuland, the ubiquitous State Department official who ends up in power no matter whether you vote for George Bush and Dick Cheney or Barack Obama or Joe Biden. The only time when she's not in power is when Trump was elected. That's one of the reasons they hate him so much. It was the only time his wife, Victoria Nuland, didn't get to run Ukraine. Robert Kagan is now, after spending all those years lying the country into wars, including the Iraq War, is now a Washington Post editor. Do you see how lying is rewarded, how it ensures that you explode up the corporate ladder in corporate media? Same exact script. All in 5 days or 4 days. A Trump dictatorship is increasingly inevitable. We should stop pretending. Will his presidency turn into a dictatorship? The odds are, again, pretty good. The Trump administration will be filled with people who will not need explicit instruction from Trump any more than Hitler's local Gautiers needed instruction. In such circumstances, people work toward the Fuhrer, which is to say they anticipate his desires and seek favor through acts they think will make him happy, thereby enhancing their own influence and power in the process. We can expect more of this when the war against the, quote, deep state begins in earnest. This is what they're really afraid of. Trump says he's on the warpath against the CIA, the FBI, the Pentagon, the NSA. And these people live on the U.S. security state. They love it. It's the weapons of war that they use. According to Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, there is a whole cabal determined to undermine American security. A, quote, uniparty of elites made up neoconservatives on the right and liberal globalists on the left who are not true Americans and therefore do not have the true interests of America at heart. That is the uniparty. Neoconservatives and establishment liberal interventionists. He described that perfectly. This is why Robert Kagan, well before Trump came on the scene, was preparing to support Hillary Clinton. There's an op-ed article on this in 2014 in the New York Times, Hillary Clinton's Next Act. It talks about how neocons were lining up behind her because they saw in her a much more promising warmonger than the increasingly anti-interventionist Republican Party. This has been going on forever. Should Trump be successful in launching a campaign of persecution and the opposition prove powerless to stop it, then the nation will have begun an irreversible descent into dictatorship. Robert Kagan has been calling people Hitler forever. He called Saddam Hussein Hitler and Assad Hitler and Gaddafi, all the people they wanted to go to war against. It's just he opens his mouth and he labels people Hitler. These are the people who are the serious foreign policy experts at the highest levels of our corporate media. Here is Liz Cheney. Obviously, she's an enthusiastic supporter of the war in Iraq to this very day. Has supported every single American war, just like her dad. Her dad supported the Vietnam War, but unfortunately couldn't go fight in it himself. Got deferment, sent a bunch of other people to die in it. And that's what the Cheney family continues to do. And she, of course, is obsessed monomaniacally with her anti-Trump hatred. And the media loves her. They're now promoting her anti-Trump book, even though Liz Cheney has no constituency other than some liberals. She got booted out of office by a record 36-point loss in the Republican primary. when running for re-election last year. Here she is on CBS, exactly the same script.
You say Donald Trump, if he is reelected, it will be the end of the republic. What do you mean?
He's told us what he will do. It's very easy to see the steps that he will take. People who say, well, if he's elected, it's not that dangerous because we have all of these checks and balances, don't fully understand the extent to which the Republicans in Congress today have been co-opted. One of the things that we see happening today is a sort of a sleepwalking into dictatorship in the United States.
Isn't it so obvious and blatant that they all got together and decided to say this all at once? This was December 3rd. This all is emerging within 3 days. And every major corporate media outlet coming from the same group of people, the same warmongering neocons. I got my start in journalism. I began writing about politics because the war on terror under George Bush and Dick Cheney was little more than an attempt to import authoritarianism of the kind they pretend to be so concerned about into the United States, with these radical theories of executive power that said the president can do anything in the name of national security, even break the law. They had all kind of lawless torture camps and detention, due process-free detention camps. They spied on Americans without the warrants required by law. They are what they're trying to convince Americans Trump will really be this time if he wins. Here's Ann Applebaum, one of the very same people who is so concerned that Trump will abandon NATO if he wins. That's her warning. And then here is David Frum, who was George W. Bush's speechwriter, spent 2003 calling Americans conservatives who didn't support the war in Iraq unpatriotic. These are the worst people, the most destructive people. And they've united to try and claim that if the Americans elect Donald Trump, as they seem poised to do according to polls, they're going to get a new Hitler. Here's David Frum warning about the danger ahead in the Atlantic. If Donald Trump returns to the White House, he better bring a better understanding of the systemic vulnerabilities, more willing enablers, and a more focused agenda of retaliation against his adversaries. A second Trump turn would instantly plunge the country into a constitutional crisis more terrible than anything seen since the Civil War. Even in the turmoil of the 1960s, even during the Great Depression, the country had a functioning government with the president as its head, but the government cannot function with an indicted or convicted criminal at its head. The president would be an outlaw or on his way to becoming an outlaw. For his own survival, he would have to destroy the rule of law. If Trump wins the presidency again, the whole world will become a theater for his politics of revenge and reward. Ukraine will be abandoned to Vladimir Putin. Anyway, the United States would be too paralyzed by troubles at home to help friends abroad. Even if the harm is contained, it can never be fully undone, as the harm of January 6th can never be undone. They're such drama queens. They know people have tuned them out. People hate the media in this country. They despise it. They don't trust it. And they don't trust the institutions of authority either, which is why Trump is leading in the polls despite being indicted 4 separate times. Because Americans look and don't see that as a credible accusation of criminality. They see it as a corrupted one. And so the only thing these people can do, what they've been doing for decades, is run around warning everybody and screaming and ranting about and raving about Hitler. Even though these people are the most authoritarian ones in the country, in addition to being the most deceitful and having the most blood on their hands. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.